Rain hammered the roof of the tiny roadside garage as 68-year-old Ruth Carter wiped grease from her hands and prepared to close for the night. Most people in town barely noticed the old black mechanic anymore, until a pack of stranded bikers rolled in, soaked, angry, and desperate. While others would have turned them away, Ruth stayed up all night repairing their machines with quiet patience. Bidam, the storm finally cleared, and the sound of a convoy of black SUVs echoed down the empty highway. What stepped out of the lead vehicle made Ruth freeze in silence, and suddenly every biker in her shop stood at attention. The town of Maplewood Crossing sat along a stretch of Highway 41 like a forgotten footnote, a two-block main street, a diner that hadn't changed its menu since the 1980s, and a gas station whose neon sign flickered on and off depending on whether the wind was blowing from the east or the west. Most drivers passed through without stopping, eyes fixed on the road ahead, the town visible only as a blur of clapboard buildings and chain-link fences in their peripheral vision. Those who did stop usually needed gas, maybe a cup of bitter coffee and a bathroom, and then they were gone again, swallowed by the highway, as if Maplewood Crossing had never existed at all. For most of its residents, this invisibility was simply the rhythm of life, something you either accepted or something that slowly wore you down until accepting and surrendering felt like the same thing. Ruth Carter's garage sat at the edge of town, exactly where the asphalt cracked and crumbled into the gravel shoulder of the highway. The building was old, not charmingly old, not vintage or quaint, but genuinely, stubbornly old, in the way that only structures built by hand and maintained by will ever managed to be. The white paint on the exterior had long since gone gray, then yellow at the edges where the sun hit hardest. The sign above the roll-up door read, "Carter's Auto and Cycle," the letters hand-stenciled in black paint that had been touched up so many times that the newest layers sat on top of the older ones in slight misalignment, giving the whole sign the slightly blurred appearance of a sentence spoken through a mouthful of exhaustion. A single floodlight, mounted above the sign, threw a cone of yellow light into the parking lot each evening, attracting moths and the occasional confused bat. Illuminating the two gas pumps Ruth had kept running through 3 decades of mechanical coaxing and stubborn refusal to replace them. Inside, the garage smelled of motor oil and iron, and something faintly sweet that no one who visited could ever quite identify later. Some would guess it was the coffee. Ruth kept simmering on a hot plate in the corner, a battered aluminum percolator that had brewed its first pot sometime in the late 1990s and had never once been replaced. The walls were hung with tools, arranged with a specificity that bordered on obsessive wrenches, graded by size from left to right, sockets nested in their labeled holders, specialty tools whose names most mechanics only half remembered, hung with the same care as other people reserved for framed photographs. And photographs there were as well, tucked between the tool racks and mounted above the workbench in mismatched frames, some in black and white, some in the washed-out color of old Kodachrome, some in the sharper tones of more recent decades. Ruth never spoke about most of them. She simply worked beneath their silent gaze each day, her movements as practiced and unhurried as water finding its level. The people of Maplewood Crossing had, over the years, developed a particular relationship with Ruth Carter that they would have struggled to articulate honestly. They brought her their trucks when the dealership was booked out. They asked her to look at their tractors when the harvest seasons brought mechanical failures at the worst possible times. They paid her in cash, sometimes in casseroles or cuts of venison, and they were genuinely grateful in the specific way that people are grateful to someone they don't quite believe exists. Because what Ruth was, what she had always been, sat slightly outside the frame of what they expected the world to look like. A 68-year-old black woman running a garage on the edge of a mostly white small town, diagnosing engine faults by sound alone, rebuilding transmissions that certified shops had declared irreparable, doing it all in a pair of worn work boots, and a canvas apron that had absorbed so much oil over the years, it had become its own kind of armor. The town admired her, the way people admire something that confuses them at a distance, with a mixture of respect and a faint, unexamined wariness. New residents sometimes wandered in, with a skepticism they didn't bother to fully conceal. A few years back, a man named Patterson had moved up from the city, bought the old hardware store, and converted it into a real estate office. He'd brought his Cadillac to Ruth once, grudgingly, when the dealership was backed up 6 weeks. He'd stood in the doorway of the garage with his arms crossed and watched her work with the expression of a man waiting to be proven right about something. When she'd handed him his keys 40 minutes later and explained the valve timing issue in language that was technically precise and completely accessible at the same time, he'd paid without a word and driven away faster than was strictly polite. He'd never come back, which Ruth understood was its own form of tribute, the kind paid by men who find their certainty gently dismantled and don't know how to sit with the feeling. She had been doing this for over 30 years on this particular stretch of highway, but her hands had known engines since long before that. She never talked about it, not anymore, not to the people who asked. She'd simply shake her head and say that was a long time ago, and steer the conversation toward whatever vehicle needed attention. But the knowledge was there in everything she did, in the way she pressed 2 fingers lightly against a running engine block, the way a doctor touches a patient's wrist to feel a pulse, in the way she listened with her head slightly tilted, eyes focused on something that wasn't quite in the room, hearing the story an engine tells in its pitch and rhythm and silence. She had learned to hear machines the way some people learn to hear music, not just the notes but the spaces between them, not just the sound, but what the sound was trying to say. On the evening everything changed. Ruth had been alone since 4 in the afternoon. She'd finished an oil change and a brake job, eaten half a sandwich she'd brought from home, drunk 2 cups of coffee, and was considering locking up early for the first time in recent memory. The radio on the shelf above her tool chest was playing something old and unhurried. A jazz trumpet winding through a melody like smoke, finding its way through a slightly open window. The rain had started around 6, first as a whisper on the roof, and then as a steady percussion that turned the parking lot into a shallow lake and reduced the highway to a river of headlights and spray. Ruth didn't mind rain. She'd always found it clarifying, the way it simplified the world down to the sound of water and the smell of wet earth and the warmth of a space that kept the weather out. She refilled her coffee, turned the radio up slightly, and stood in the open doorway of the garage, watching the highway run with rain. The sound came before the lights, a rough, irregular rumble that cut through the white noise of the storm with a specificity that made Ruth straighten up. An engine misfiring, she registered immediately. Then a second and a third, multiple bikes, all running rough, all carrying the sound of machines that had been pushed past the point where they should have been stopped. The headlights appeared a few seconds later, a wavering column of white cutting through the rain, and then the first motorcycle turned off the highway into her lot, followed by another and another, until there were 9 of them arranged in a loose cluster under the floodlight, their engines coughing and steaming in the cold rain. They were soaked. Not just wet the way people get caught in a shower, but soaked in the bone-deep way of people who had been riding through hard weather for hours without adequate protection, the kind of wet that had found its way through every layer and settled in. They wore leather jackets and heavy jeans, most of them, helmets or bandanas tied at the jaw, and they sat on their bikes for a moment in the rain, as if not quite believing they'd found a garage, or perhaps not quite believing what kind of garage they'd found. Ruth stood in the doorway with her coffee cup, watching them. The one who moved first was the biggest, a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, who swung off his bike with the practiced ease of someone who'd been riding since before he had a license. He walked toward the garage with his thumbs hooked in his belt, and an expression Ruth had seen many times before. A man who had a problem and was calculating, in real time, how much of his pride he was willing to set aside in order to solve it. He stopped under the overhang, out of the rain, and looked at Ruth with flat eyes. His name was Dean Holloway. He didn't offer it yet, and Ruth didn't ask. "We need help," he said, without preamble. "Multiple bikes down. Fuel system issues on at least 3 of them. One's running so hot it's probably seized." He paused, looked past her into the garage, then back at her. "You, the mechanic?" "I'm the only one here," Ruth said. "So yes." Something shifted behind Dean's eyes, a rapid recalibration that Ruth had watched play out on many faces over the years. He glanced back at his group, most of whom were now dismounting, and then back at Ruth, and she could see him doing the math, weighing his skepticism against the fact that there was no one else, no other garage for 40 miles in either direction, no tow trucks running in weather like this, no other option. "All right," he said, in a tone that communicated clearly that this was a concession rather than a choice, and turned to wave the others in. They came in out of the rain in ones and twos, leading or pushing their bikes, filling up the garage with the smell of wet leather and exhaust, and the specific collective tension of people who'd been in uncomfortable conditions together long enough that everyone's patience was threadbare. Ruth set down her coffee and moved to the first bike without ceremony, a big touring model, engine bay still ticking with heat, and she crouched beside it and laid one hand against the engine casing, with her eyes closed for exactly 4 seconds. "Fuel injector's clogged," she said. "Probably has been since before the rain. You were masking it by running hard." She moved to the next bike. "This one's ignition coil. Third cylinder's misfiring." She walked down the line, pausing at each machine, her face neutral and focused, touching, listening, and naming faults in a quiet, precise voice that carried no performance and no hesitation. By the time she reached the last bike, the one Dean had flagged as potentially seized the garage had gone very quiet. The bikers were watching her in the particular silence that falls over people when something they were certain of turns out to be wrong. "That's not seized," Ruth said of the last bike, pressing her fingertips to the engine casing near the top end. "The thermostat failed. It was running hot, but the piston's fine. You got lucky." She straightened up and looked at Dean. "I can fix all of them. It'll take most of the night." Dean stared at her for a long moment. "You can fix all of them," he repeated. "Did I stutter?" Ruth said mildly, and turned back toward her workbench to collect her tools. The night settled into its own particular rhythm. Ruth worked, and the bikers gradually found the spaces in the garage that felt least intrusive, a few sitting on overturned crates near the workbench, a few more leaning against the wall by the door where they could watch the rain without being in it. Someone found the hot plate and the percolator, and Ruth wordlessly pointed at the shelf where the coffee was kept. And within 20 minutes, there were mugs being passed around. And the hard-edged tension of the group's arrival had softened into something closer to a tentative companionship. Her name was Ruth, they learned, and she'd had this garage for 30 years. No, she didn't have a website. Yes, she could fix motorcycles. She could fix most things with an engine, as a matter of fact, and a few things without one. She answered their questions with an economy of words that some of them initially read as coldness, but which over the course of an hour resolved into something else. The manner of someone who has learned to say exactly what is necessary and has long since stopped spending energy on what is not. She worked while she talked, never stopping, never fumbling, moving through the repairs with the fluency of pure long practice. The bikers' names came out gradually, in the way that names do in late-night situations, as if the ordinary social calculus of introduction requires a certain warmth before it operates. There was Marcus, who was Dean's cousin and the group's de facto navigator, a quiet man who seemed to observe everything from behind a carefully maintained reserve. There was Tamara, the only woman in the group who had more mechanical knowledge than most of the others combined, and who watched Ruth with a focused, appreciative attention that was different in character from the others' watchfulness. There was Pete, who was cheerful in the way that people are cheerful when they've decided that anxiety is wasted energy, and Carlos, and a young man named Eli, who couldn't have been more than 23, and who sat near the workbench with his hands around his coffee mug and watched Ruth work with the expression of someone watching a language being spoken that he very much wanted to learn. It was Tamara who asked, eventually, why Ruth lived alone out here, whether she had family, whether she'd thought about retiring. The question was asked with genuine warmth, not intrusion, and Ruth paused over the fuel injector she was cleaning and considered it with the seriousness it deserved. "My husband George built this garage," she said. "He passed 11 years ago. Garage is the last thing we built together." She resumed cleaning the injector with a small wire brush. "People keep asking me to sell it. There's a company out of the city that's been after it for 2 years. Wants the property for a chain service center." "And you won't sell," Tamara said. "Not to them," Ruth said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." There was a pause. Rain ran down the roof in sheets and gathered in the lot outside with a sound like distant applause. "What do you mean, not yet?" Marcus asked. Ruth set down the injector and looked at the workbench rather than at any of them. "The bank's been patient," she said, "but patient has a due date. Everything does." No one pushed further. The information settled among them like something fragile that needed to be handled carefully, and the conversation moved to other things where they'd been riding, where they were headed, the quality of the roads south of the state line, the specific miseries of a cold rain at highway speeds. Ruth reinstalled the injector, moved to the ignition coil, and the garage filled with the small, purposeful sounds of tools and work, and the rain's steady percussion on the roof overhead. Dean Holloway didn't soften easily or quickly, but he was, underneath the hard angles of his manner, a man who paid attention to things. He watched Ruth work through most of the night, with the same expression flat, assessing, impossible to read, but he watched. He saw how she moved around the bikes without wasted motion, how she diagnosed with her hands and ears rather than waiting for a computer to tell her what was wrong, how she worked on his own bike, the one with the most serious issues, with a patience and precision that the machine seemed almost to respond to, as if being handled by someone who understood it deeply made it cooperate differently than it otherwise would. His bike had given him trouble for 2 months. He'd taken it to a certified Harley dealership in the city twice, and both times they'd returned it to him with the specific problem unresolved, buried under a list of other things they'd charged him for. He'd lived with the rough idle and the periodic stalling, because the alternative had seemed to be a third round of the same frustrating exercise, and he was a man who found frustration difficult to sustain without it becoming anger, and anger at a machine felt undignified. Ruth found the real problem in 40 minutes. A combination of a slightly warped throttle body and a fuel pressure regulator that was failing intermittently, the kind of fault that doesn't always show on diagnostic software, because it only manifests under specific load, conditions. She explained this to Dean in plain language while she worked, not looking at him, just talking through what she was finding the way a surgeon might narrate a procedure to residents watching from above. The dealership probably ran the code reader, and it came back clean, she said, because it only throws a fault code when the pressure drops past a certain threshold, and the system hasn't been under load long enough. You'd need to road test it while monitoring live data to catch it. Most shops don't bother. Dean stood with his arms crossed, watching her hands. Why do you bother? He asked. Ruth looked up at him briefly. Because that's the job, she said, and went back to work. He turned away and stood in the doorway of the garage for a while, looking at the rain, his coffee going cold in his hand. He was a man who didn't apologize easily, and he knew it, and there was a specific discomfort that comes from recognizing that the way you've been treating someone was wrong without yet being in a position to do anything about it. He'd been dismissive from the moment they'd pulled in. Not cruel, he didn't think of himself as cruel, but dismissive in the particular, automatic way that is its own kind of cruelty, because it requires no effort and inflicts its damage without the expenditure of any real intention. He noticed, sometime around 2 in the morning, that Ruth was flexing her right hand between tasks, opening and closing it slowly, the way people do when joints ache in the cold and damp. She didn't stop working. She didn't mention it. She just flexed her hand, let it rest for a count of 3, and picked up her wrench again. It was Eli who saw the photographs first. He'd wandered to the back wall of the garage during a lull, drawn by the gallery of framed images in their mismatched frames, and he stood in front of them for a long moment with his coffee mug halfway to his mouth, his eyes moving from one image to the next with an increasing intensity that eventually drew Marcus over, and then Tamara, and then several others, until most of the group was standing at the back wall of the garage, studying the photographs while Ruth worked in the foreground, oblivious or unconcerned. There were pictures of engines, detailed close-up shots of modified machinery that meant nothing to most people, but which Tamara stared at with narrowing eyes, recognizing configurations that she associated with a level of engineering knowledge most professionals never reached. There were pictures of a racing circuit, not a local track or an amateur event, but a place that Marcus recognized, with a slow-building shock, as the circuit at Riverside, one of the legendary venues of American motorsport that had been active through the 1970s and early 80s. And there, in a photograph whose color had faded to the warm amber of old wine, was a woman who could only have been Ruth, 20 years old at most, wearing a racing team's coveralls, standing beside a motorcycle that had clearly been modified beyond recognition, surrounded by a crew of men in similar coveralls who were all looking at the camera with the particular expression of a team that has just won something significant. Eli read the writing on the coveralls. He read the number on the bike. He looked at Marcus, and Marcus looked at Tamara, and Tamara looked at the photograph for another long moment, and then turned to look at Ruth. This is from the '78 championship, Tamara said, not loudly, but in the particular carrying tone of someone who cannot contain the weight of what they're saying. The Riverside Series. The Kellerman team won that year on a modified engine that nobody could figure out. Experts spent years trying to reverse engineer what they did with the fuel delivery system. She paused. This is that team. Ruth didn't look up from her work. Old pictures, she said. Ruth. Tamara's voice was different now, not reverential, exactly, but carrying a quality of recognition that had weight to it. Are you the one who built that engine? A silence. Rain on the roof. The small sounds of a wrench being set down on a metal surface. George and I built it together, Ruth said. He got most of the credit. That's how things were, back then. She picked up a different wrench. Still had to build it right either way. The bikers exchanged looks in the small, charged silence that followed. No one knew quite what to say. What they had heard was simultaneously smaller and larger than what they'd expected. Smaller because it was stated without drama or self-pity. Larger because of everything the plainness of the statement contained. Back then, that's how things were. 7 words that carried the weight of an entire era of deliberate, systematic erasure, delivered without a tremor, without an invitation for sympathy. Dean, who had come over from the doorway and stood at the edge of the group, said nothing at all. He looked at the photograph for a long time, and then turned and went back to his spot near the door, and he stood there with his back to the room for several minutes, looking out at the rain. At 6 in the morning, when the sky had begun to lighten from black to the deep gray blue that precedes a dawn, a car pulled into the lot. Not a truck, not a motorcycle, a sedan, dark and forgettable, driven by a man in a collared shirt who held a leather briefcase against his chest as he got out and stood in what remained of the rain, with the expression of someone who very much didn't want to be where they were. His name was Greer. He worked for First National Lending, and he had a form in his briefcase and a deadline that fell at 9 o'clock that morning. He knocked on the frame of the open garage door. Ruth looked up from the last bike she was working on, Dean's, now nearly complete, and registered Greer's face and his briefcase, and the expression he was wearing with a single glance, and something in her posture changed. Not collapsed, not defeated, but settled, the way a structure settles into the ground when it finally stops resisting. "Morning, Mr. Greer," she said. "Miss Carter." He cleared his throat. "I apologize for the hour. I'm aware this isn't ideal timing." "Come in out of the rain," she said. He came in, and the bikers, who had been in various states of half-sleep and quiet conversation, straightened up and went still the way people go, still when they recognize that something serious is happening. Greer set his briefcase on the corner of the workbench that Ruth cleared for him without being asked, and he opened it and took out a document that was several pages long and clipped together with a blue binder clip, and he set it in front of Ruth and stepped back. "The original forbearance period ended last month," he said. "We extended once. I'm afraid we're not able to extend again. The outstanding balance on the property note is—" He named a figure. It was not, in the context of commercial real estate, a devastating number. In the context of a 68-year-old woman running a one-bay garage on a state highway in a town of 3,000 people, it was an impossible one. Ruth looked at the document. She didn't pick it up. She looked at it the way someone looks at a thing they have known was coming for a long time, and about which they have made their peace, imperfect as that peace might be. Then she looked up at Greer, whose eyes were directed slightly to the left of her face, in the manner of a man delivering bad news who is trying to avoid direct accountability for its delivery. "Is there a grace period after signing?" she asked. 30 days, Greer said. She nodded. "I'll have your pen," she said. "Ruth." Dean's voice came from across the garage, hard and sudden. Everyone in the room turned. He was standing with his arms at his sides, and an expression on his face that was not quite anger, but was adjacent to it, something that came from a place closer to the chest. "You don't have to sign that right now." "Mr. Greer drove out in the rain," Ruth said calmly. "It's his job." "It's not right," Dean said. Ruth looked at him for a moment. It was the first time she had looked at him directly in a long time, and her expression was not unkind, but it was clear. "I don't need rescue," she said. "I need a pen." Greer produced the pen. Ruth signed. She handed the document back with the particular dignity of someone who has decided that how they perform an act matters more than the act itself. She handed Greer his pen and his briefcase, and she walked him to the door, and she thanked him for driving out in the rain. He drove away, and Ruth went back to the last bike, and the sound of her wrench on the engine casing resumed as if nothing had changed. But something in the garage had shifted. The silence that fell after Greer's car disappeared down the highway was different from the silence that had preceded it, heavier and charged with the specific quality of collective emotion that has no obvious outlet. The dawn came in sideways, the way it does after a storm has cleared, not gradually but suddenly, as if the sky has been waiting for permission to turn gold. The clouds that had dropped rain all night were pulling apart to the west, and through the gaps came the kind of light that falls on wet surfaces and makes everything look briefly, achingly beautiful. The puddles in the lot, the chrome of the motorcycles, the white-gray siding of the garage, all of it caught in that particular slant of early light that makes even ordinary things look like they belong in a painting. Ruth was standing in the doorway with her coffee, watching it, when she heard the sound. She heard it before any of the bikers did. The low, smooth rumble of well-maintained, high-displacement engines, multiple vehicles moving in formation at speed. Not motorcycles, something heavier, more deliberate. She set her coffee on the pump ledge and stood with her hands in her apron pockets and watched the highway. The convoy appeared from the south. 4 black SUVs, running in tight formation, maintaining a pace that spoke of purpose. They slowed as they approached the lot, and the lead vehicle turned in, followed by the others. And they parked in a line along the edge of the lot with the practiced precision of people accustomed to moving as a unit. The engines shut off. Silence fell. The kind of silence that comes between a thing being about to happen and the thing itself. In the garage behind Ruth, she heard Dean and Marcus and the others come forward, drawn by the sound, and she could feel without turning that they had arranged themselves in a loose cluster at her back, watching the SUVs with the guarded attention of people who don't know what they're seeing but understand that it is significant. The door of the lead SUV opened, and a man stepped out. He was in his mid-70s, lean and straight-backed, wearing a dark jacket over a collared shirt, silver-haired, moving with the deliberate care of a man who has lived long enough to understand that movement is not free and should not be wasted. He had the kind of face that has been weathered by both weather and decades of attention paid to things that mattered, and he wore it the way some people wear a long record of serious living, not heavily, not with performance, but as a simple and irreducible fact. 2 other men got out of the passenger side and the rear, and they stayed by the vehicle as the silver-haired man walked forward, alone. He walked toward the garage, toward Ruth. His eyes were on her from the moment he stepped out of the vehicle, not searching, not uncertain, but direct, with the quality of a man who has arrived at a specific destination after a very long journey and is not going to waste the moment by looking anywhere else. He stopped 8 feet from her. In the garage behind her, Ruth heard the bikers fall absolutely still. She looked at him. He looked at her. The dawn light fell between them, golden and sharp, and the puddles in the lot reflected it in broken pieces. Ruth Carter, the man said. His voice was the voice of someone who had given many speeches and kept few of them, and what remained was just the voice itself, low, steady, worn to its essentials. I have been looking for you for a very long time. His name was James Whitfield. There were people in the world of American motorsport for whom that name required no elaboration. For everyone else, James Whitfield was the man who had turned a failing regional motorcycle manufacturing company into one of the most respected names in high-performance American engineering over the course of 40 years, who had won more championships through engineering innovation than through any advantage of money or connections, who had built a legacy that existed not in trophies, but in the DNA of the machines themselves, in the approaches to engine design and fuel management that had become standard across an industry and whose origins most people had long since stopped tracing back to their source. Ruth stood with her hands still in her apron pockets and looked at him and waited. I was at Riverside in '78, Whitfield said. I was on the competing team. We came in second. He stopped. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile. Something older and more complicated than a smile. I spent the better part of 2 years trying to figure out what George Kellerman did to that engine. I talked to everyone on that crew. Everyone. He paused again, and then I finally talked to a woman who had worked on the engine crew, a woman named Diane Parrish, who was dying of cancer, and said she had something she needed to put right before she left. She told me that George Kellerman didn't build that engine, not the relevant parts, not the fuel delivery system, not the variable timing mechanism, not any of the things that made that engine what it was. Ruth didn't move. She told me you built it, Whitfield said. That you designed it and built it, and that George took the credit because that's how things worked, and that you never said a word about it publicly because you loved him, and because you understood that in 1978, a black woman's name on a championship-winning engine design wasn't something the industry was ready to acknowledge. Behind Ruth, someone exhaled sharply. Tamara, she thought, though she didn't turn to see. Diane Parrish told me your name, Whitfield said. And I started looking. That was 4 years ago. He looked around the lot, at the garage, at the worn sign above the door. It took me longer than it should have. I'm sorry for that. Ruth looked at him for a long time. A cloud shadow crossed the lot, moving fast, and the golden light dimmed briefly, and then returned. Diane always had a good memory, Ruth said finally. Better than most, Whitfield agreed. What is it you want, Mr. Whitfield? Ruth said, not coldly, genuinely. It was the question of a woman who had learned not to assume the answer. Whitfield reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and removed a folded document. He didn't open it. He held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment, and then at Ruth. I want to do several things, he said. First, I want to clear your property debt. That's not charity. That's the least that should have been done decades ago. Second, I want to put your name on the work you did, officially and publicly. The Whitfield Foundation has been building a museum of American motorcycle engineering history, and your engine design should be the centerpiece of it, with your name on it. He paused. Third and only, if you want this, I want to restore this garage. Not replace it, restore it. And use it as a working training center for young engineers who look like people who don't usually get to learn this trade. With you as the foundation of it, as long as you're willing. The silence that followed was the deepest silence the garage had known that night. Dean Holloway, who had been standing a step behind Ruth's left shoulder, made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something involuntary that came from a place he didn't have language for, a man who had spent the night recalibrating his understanding of something and had now arrived at the reckoning of it. Ruth Carter did not weep. She did not throw her arms open or raise her voice or perform any of the gestures that the moment, according to every convention, seemed to call for. She stood in the doorway of her garage in her canvas apron and her worn work boots, and she looked at James Whitfield with the expression of a woman absorbing something enormous, with the same quiet steadiness she brought to everything. Elsa. And then she looked down at her hands, the grease still in the creases of her knuckles, the slight swelling at the joints that told the story of 50 years of work, and she was still for a long moment. George would have liked you, she said finally. He respected people who understood engineering. From what I know of George, Whitfield said carefully, he was a man who understood talent better than he acknowledged it. A small sound came from Ruth that might have been a laugh and might have been something else. He was complicated, she said. Most people worth knowing are. She looked up at Whitfield again, direct and clear-eyed, about the garage. Yes, he said. The sign stays. The sign stays, he agreed, immediately. And it's still open to anyone who drives in off the highway with a broken vehicle. That doesn't change. It doesn't change. She looked at the document in his hands, and then at him. I'll need to have someone look at whatever you're asking me to sign. I'm done signing things without reading them first. Absolutely, Whitfield said, and the slight strain at the corners of his eyes resolved into something that was genuinely a smile. Ruth turned and looked at the bikers behind her, Dean and Marcus and Tamara and Eli and the others, all of them standing in the doorway of the garage with the light behind them, looking like a photograph of something she hadn't expected to happen. She looked at Dean last, and he was standing very straight, his arms at his sides, and his face was doing something that it was clear it didn't often do, something unguarded and raw that he hadn't prepared a defense against. Your bikes are all done, she said. You can settle up with me before you go. Ruth Dean started. Full price, she said. No charity. That's not how this works. The weeks that followed were strange in the way that things are strange when they have been decided, but not yet fully real, when the shape of a change is known, but the texture of it is still in the future. Greer received a call from a law firm representing the Whitfield Foundation, and the matter of the property note was resolved, with a quickness that Greer found slightly disorienting, as if he had become a minor character in a story whose scale he had only now understood. The people of Maplewood Crossing heard about it in pieces From the diner waitress who had seen the black SUVs, from the gas station owner who had pumped their fuel, from Marcus, who had stopped in town on the way out to buy road supplies, and mentioned, in the understated way of a man who has witnessed something significant and is still processing it, that something interesting had happened at Carter's garage. By the end of the week, people had begun driving past more slowly. Some stopped. A reporter from the regional paper came out on a Wednesday with a notebook and a camera, and Ruth sat with him at the workbench and answered his questions in the same economical way she answered all questions, and the story that ran in the paper the following Saturday was accurate and clear, and carried a photograph of Ruth at her workbench that the photographer had taken without asking her to pose, catching her in the middle of work, looking at something in her hands with an expression of focused attention that the photographer would later say was the best portrait he'd ever taken, because it told you immediately and completely what kind of person she was. The bikers came back. Not all at once, and not because they'd planned to. It was more that they had been in the proximity of something and found, when they returned to their ordinary lives, that the memory of it had weight, and that weight made the distance feel less than it should have. Marcus came back first, 2 weeks after, on a pretext of a carburetor issue that Ruth fixed in 15 minutes, and which she charged him for with perfect seriousness. Tamra came the week after that and stayed for 3 hours, asking Ruth questions about engine design and listening with the focused hunger of someone discovering a resource they hadn't known existed. Eli came and asked if he could watch, and stayed until Ruth told him he might as well be useful and handed him a wrench. Dean Holloway came back alone, on a Tuesday morning, when the lot was empty and the garage was quiet. He pulled in and turned off his engine and sat on his bike for a moment, and then he got off and walked over to where Ruth was standing in the open bay door, and he stood in front of her and said, without preamble, "I was wrong about you." "I know," Ruth said. "I was wrong about more than you," he said. "I know that too," she said. "You want coffee?" He came in and had coffee, and he stayed for most of the day, and Ruth found tasks for him that matched what he knew how to do, and taught him things he didn't when the opportunity came naturally, and by the time he left in the late afternoon, the light was orange and long, and the highway was quiet, and he pulled out of the lot and turned south toward home, and he rode steadily into the fading light of the day with something in his chest that felt like the particular relief of a weight set down that he hadn't known he'd been carrying. The restoration of Carter's garage took 4 months. The Whitfield Foundation sent people who had been briefed carefully on what Ruth had said, that the character of the place was not to be improved out of existence, that the function was more important than the form, that the sign stayed. What resulted was something that satisfied both the practical requirements of a training facility and the emotional requirements of a place that was, at its foundation, a memorial to a man named George Carter and the work he and his wife had done together. The bays were expanded, a second one added, a third put in as the renovation scope grew, but the original bay, the first one, the one with the hot plate and the percolator and the tool wall and the photographs, remained exactly as it had been. Ruth supervised the work on this point without compromise, and everyone who worked on the renovation quickly learned that this was not a negotiating position. The museum opened in the spring, 3 hours east, in a building that had once been a factory, and had been restored with the same underlying principle that history should be legible in the bones of a place. The centerpiece, as Whitfield had promised, was the 1978 championship engine, the real one, not a replica, retrieved from a collection where it had sat for decades, identified only by a stock number, mounted in a case with a placard that read, in clean bronze letters, designed and built by Ruth Carter and George Carter, Kellerman Racing, 1977, 1978. Ruth attended the opening on a Thursday morning and stood in front of the placard for a long time without speaking, and no one who was there presumed to interpret what she was feeling, because it belonged entirely to her. The training center opened that same month. The first cohort was 12 students, ranging in age from 17 to 26, selected from applications that had come from community programs across 4 states. Ruth taught on Tuesdays and Thursdays mornings because she still opened the garage for regular business in the afternoons, and her teaching was exactly like her working, patient and precise and entirely without condescension, grounded in the conviction that understanding was the goal and that the path to understanding ran through the hands. Eli was her first assistant instructor. He had quit a job he disliked to take the position, and he did not regret it. On a morning in late spring, nearly 7 months after the night of the storm, Ruth Carter opened the garage at 6:45 in the morning, as she always did. The air smelled of damp earth and gasoline, and the faint sweetness she had never been able to identify and had long since stopped trying to. She set the percolator on the hot plate. She switched on the old radio. She stood in the open bay door and looked out at the highway, which was empty in the early light, a straight gray line running north and south through the world, flanked by the bright new green of the grass that comes up after a wet spring, with the sky above it, going from deep blue at the horizon to pale gold where the sun was beginning to breach the tree line. She heard the sound before she saw anything. A motorcycle one, running clean and steady, coming from the north. She watched the highway, and a single headlight appeared around the long curve by the mile marker, and the bike slowed as it approached and turned into the lot and stopped. It was a young woman, early 20s, with a small pack on her back, and the look of someone who had been riding since before the sun was fully up. She pulled off her helmet and looked at the sign above the bay door, and then at Ruth. "Are you open?" the young woman asked. "Always," Ruth said. "Come in." She poured a second cup of coffee and set it on the workbench. And the young woman came into the light of the garage and set her helmet on a crate and looked around at the walls, the tools, the photographs, the engine parts in various stages of disassembly, and something in her face opened, the way faces open when people encounter a place that answers a question they hadn't known they were asking. Ruth listened to the bike. She heard the slight hesitation at idle, the specific character of a carburetor that needed attention, the deeper steadiness underneath it that told her the machine was fundamentally sound and had been well cared for. She went to the workbench and began to gather her tools, and the morning light fell through the open bay door and lay in long rectangles on the concrete floor, and the radio played something old and quiet and good, and outside the lot, the highway ran on in both directions, toward everything it had ever carried and everything it had yet to bring. Years later, the people who had grown up in Maplewood Crossing would try to explain to their children what it had been like before the training center, before the museum, before the sign on Highway 41 that directed travelers to a garage run by a woman whose name was now in textbooks and on plaques and in the kind of spoken histories that circulate through industries for generations. They would try to explain that she had always been there, that she had been there the whole time, that the highway had run past her door for 30 years while the world drove by without stopping to understand what it was passing. They would tell their children that greatness does not always announce itself, that it sometimes sits at the edge of a highway in a tired building with a flickering sign and waits, with infinite patience, for the night when everything changes. And the children would ask, "Was she famous?" And the adults would say, "She became famous, but that's not the same thing as what she was. What she was had nothing to do with who knew about it." People drove past her for years, never realizing the greatest mechanic on the highway was hidden inside that little garage.